now to Leaders' Questions under Standing Order 36, and of course I call on Deputy Mary Lou McDonald, please.
Taoiseach, last week you announced your government's quarantine proposals for those travelling here, and you described this as a plan for a system of mandatory quarantine. Of course, I told you at the time that it was nothing of the sort. In fact, the proposal that you outlined was, at best, a form of self-isolation, relying on the discretion of individuals, but it certainly did not amount to a system of mandatory quarantine. It was, Taoiseach, a half-baked plan that didn't go far enough in protecting our people, and it certainly falls short for what we need now to assist us in the fight to achieve maximum suppression of this deadly virus. But when I put it to you last week, you were adamant that your plan was well thought out, that the government was in control of the situation, and you denied that this was a half measure. Well, I have to tell you, Taoiseach, anybody listening to Minister Stephen Donnelly on the television last night will be disabused of any notion that the government has any idea as to what it's doing in terms of quarantine. I mean, this is absolutely incredible at a time when we are at the deadliest stage of this pandemic, and we have a Minister for Health that has stated that your quarantine proposal now only requires a person to stay at home. They don't even have to isolate in a single room. So the logic of that, Taoiseach, is that that individual can interact with members of their household, who then in turn may venture into the public space, meet with others and run the risk of spreading the virus. So it's very alarming, Taoiseach, to see that you're still at 6s and 7s here. And all of this underscores the fact that your quarantine proposal was not thought out at all. Indeed, Minister Donnelly couldn't give a date for when your very limited system of hotel quarantine would come into operation. Taoiseach, it's now 6 weeks since the far more infectious UK variant of the virus has been identified here. And I put it to you last week that your flawed plan was not alone too limited, but that it would take a long time to get up and running. And again, you dismissed my concerns. In fact, you said, to quote you, the measures on travel will not take weeks to implement. They will be implemented very quickly. But the Minister for Justice has now contradicted you and made clear that it will be, in fact, weeks, she says, before the legislation is introduced. Now, all of this is incredible, not least because the issue of quarantine and international travel is not a new one. We know that the Chief Medical Officer repeatedly raised concerns regarding international travel, concerns that were ignored, except for the establishment by your government months ago of a group to consider quarantine approaches, an expert group. And yet, here we are. So I have to ask you, Taoiseach, what was this group doing precisely for those months? Where is the urgency and sense of purpose from you and government on this critical issue at this extraordinary time in which we do battle with this virus? We were notified of 101 deaths yesterday, a historic low point for us in this crisis. We see the emergence of new strains of this virus, and we have a vaccination programme which is still very much in its infancy. And we also know, because the Chief Medical Officer has said it publicly, that we still don't have the capacity, the testing, the tracing capacity to hunt down this virus with the kind of speed that we require. Our ICUs are under enormous pressure. And again, this virus is taking its toll in our nursing homes. So it's for all of these reasons, Taoiseach, that we need a mandatory system of quarantine. So can I ask you to drop now the half measures, and can I ask you to opt for this full system of mandatory quarantine and to bring the legislation to that effect to the House with all urgency?
Taoiseach.
First of all, could I just say to the Deputy that I do accept that the Deputy's thinking has evolved quite significantly on travel, and I think that would be true for most members on the House. The Deputy, as early as last November, would have been very clear that people returning back to Ireland to meet with family was something that should be welcomed and something that should be facilitated. I think you used the phrase that for them coming home this Christmas is an essential journey. And we've learned clearly with the variant now that the situation is much different and far perilous in terms of both our behaviour now, because the variant is now constitutes about 70% of all cases in this country right now. So how we behave in this country is critical in terms of keeping and suppressing the virus, getting it down and keeping it down at very low levels. When I said last week, measures have already been taken in relation to travel. The Gardaí have already had checkpoints at the airports, continue to have checkpoints at the airport, has issued fines to people who are in breach of the Level 5 regulations, either travelling abroad or coming in from abroad. So that has happened. Regulations have been signed to give effect to that, to increase the fine from €100 to €500, and also regulations in relation to mandatory quarantining, particularly in specific countries, on the advice of the Chief Medical Officer, will also be introduced. And in terms of the legislation, that will be introduced to the House quickly, and we would appreciate the support of the House in getting that legislation through. And in terms of the home quarantine, the mandatory home quarantine, that's important. There are legal considerations here as well, and enforceability considerations, as well as public health advice. And the public health advice will continue in terms of self-isolation in specific cases. But in terms of policing somebody in their bedroom, that does obviously raise obvious challenges. But the concept of home quarantine is important in terms of the suppression of the virus. About 50% of the 800 who would have come in yesterday would be Irish citizens travelling back in from holidaying abroad. And I think the measures that we've brought in terms of negative PCR test obligation, for example, is having a deterrent effect. And the two-pronged strategy is, one, to deter people from travel in the first instance into Ireland, and Irish people going abroad on holidays and coming back in. And secondly, then, to protect people, particularly from any new variants that emerge over time, and that would be worrying from a public health perspective. And we will be guided at all times by the Chief Medical Officer in terms of adding countries or in terms of strengthening the quarantining provisions. But travel has collapsed into the country, and it's our objective to keep it at very, very low levels for the foreseeable future, bar essential workers and the entirety of the supply chain, which is particularly important to protect.
Taoiseach, Deputy McDonald.
Well, Taoiseach, self-isolation has always meant isolating yourself in a single room. And lots of people who have been very, very sick fought this virus isolated in a single room. And what you and your government are now describing is a very loose, very sloppy and very inadequate response, one that relies firstly on the discretion of the individual, but which doesn't even ask for full self-isolation, suggests that a person landing in Ireland can go back to a household, mix with others, and runs the real risk of spreading this virus and potentially new strains of it. Now, the fact is that the Gardaí, of course, cannot police every bedroom in the country or every home in the country. We're not asking them to, and neither should you. So not alone is it necessary to have a system of mandatory hotel quarantine, that's also the efficient and reasonable ask to make of the authorities of this state. And it's a no-brainer, Taoiseach. I cannot understand your resistance. The clearest message that can be sent for non-essential travel to stay away is mandatory quarantine. Why in God's name are you resisting something that is so obviously necessary?
There are compelling legal reasons why you cannot do what you're saying. compelling legal reasons, particularly in terms of Irish citizens coming into the country, in terms of having the capacity to home quarantining or indeed to self-isolate. They must be facilitated in that context as well. There are legal issues here too. We have our constitution, which has clear framework in terms of personal liberties and personal freedoms. So there's balancing here in terms of getting something that's that can be robust in terms of resisting legal challenge. And remember, throughout the pandemic, we've had legal challenges of one kind or another in relation to measures that we've introduced. We've had to defend ourselves against airlines early on in terms of advisories that we issued in relation to reducing non-essential travel. And we were successful in defending our position. So in coming to a framework around quarantining, we want to make absolutely sure that both on public health grounds and legally that we're on very firm footing.
Thank you, Taoiseach. Time is up.
That is an important input here.
Thank you, Taoiseach.
That said, we are willing to work with other members of the House in terms of getting as robust procedures as possible, because I believe in prolonged suppression of the virus, getting the numbers down to the lowest levels possible and keeping them there. And I would appreciate, I'd work with people in terms of achieving that objective.